Vancouver Island, tucked away in the wild heart of British Columbia, is a place where nature reigns supreme. The dense forests, ancient trees, and mist-covered hills create an eerie, almost otherworldly atmosphere. It's the kind of place where the unprepared can easily become lost, swallowed whole by the unforgiving wilderness. But for James Mackle, a software engineer from Toronto, it was the perfect escape. On July 12, 2013, he parked his rented Ford Explorer at a quiet exit off Pacific Rim Highway, ready to embark on a solo hike deep into the heart of the island's temperate rainforest. James wasn't just looking for adventure, he was seeking solitude. An experienced hiker, calm and methodical, he smiled off the warnings of an old storekeeper in Port Alberni. "It's wild out there," the man said. But James was determined. Little did anyone know, this hike would take him to a place far darker than he could ever have imagined. On the morning of July 12, 2013, James Mackle stepped out of his rented Ford Explorer and into the dense, untamed wilderness of Vancouver Island. The forest, with its towering Douglas firs and thick moss, seemed almost to swallow him whole as he made his way into the underbrush. He was a man accustomed to the solitude of nature, an experienced hiker who found peace in the quiet of the woods. His plans were simple: 5 days on the island, a solitary journey into the remote heart of its temperate rainforest, far from the popular hiking trails that drew most tourists to the area. The last person to see James before he vanished was Arthur, an older man who ran a small camping store in Port Alberni. Arthur recalled their brief conversation with a sense of foreboding. James had come in to buy supplies: freeze-dried food, a gas canister, and waterproof matches, things for a man setting off on a long hike. He had shown Arthur a map of the area, an old section south of Pacific Rim National Park, where the trails were few and the roads even fewer. Arthur, with a lifetime of experience in the area, had warned James of the dangers. The weather can change in an instant. The forest is thick. If you stray just 20 feet off the trail, you could spend hours trying to find your way back. But James had only smiled, confident in his own abilities. He wasn't deterred by the warnings. He sought the wild for its solitude, not its safety. James's disappearance was not noticed immediately. He had told his sister, Sarah, that he would return on July 17th, but when he didn't call, she wasn't overly alarmed. James was known to get caught up in the beauty of nature, sometimes extending his trips. It wasn't until the 18th, when she still hadn't heard from him, that she contacted the authorities. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police quickly launched a search, but there was no sign of him. The area James had entered was vast, and the dense forest offered little in the way of clues. His car remained parked, locked, with his wallet and documents left behind. His disappearance, it seemed, was as mysterious as the island itself. Days turned into weeks as search teams combed the forest. Police, park rangers, and volunteers worked tirelessly, following the dense undergrowth, searching by foot, and using helicopters equipped with thermal imaging to scan the area from above. But Vancouver Island's forest was no easy place to search. The canopy of ancient trees formed a nearly impenetrable green roof, blocking any view from above. The ground was thick with moss and ferns, which absorbed sound and left no trace of footsteps. The scent trails left by search dogs were quickly lost in the damp earth. Each search proved to be a futile effort. They found no footprints, no discarded food, no sign that James had even passed through. It was as though he had vanished into thin air. As time passed, the search grew increasingly frustrating. Theories began to emerge about what could have happened to James. Had he gotten lost, misjudging the vastness of the forest, his map and compass leading him astray? Could he have fallen into one of the many hidden ravines, unable to find his way back? Some speculated that he had encountered one of the island's wild animals, perhaps a bear or cougar, which might have dragged him away. But there were no signs of struggle, no blood, no remains of a wild animal attack. After 3 weeks, the search was called off. The official conclusion was that James Mackle had likely suffered an accident in the wilderness, lost, disoriented, and ultimately overwhelmed by the island's harsh elements. His case was closed as a presumed victim of the wilderness. The woods had claimed another life, or so it seemed. But despite this conclusion, the mystery of James's disappearance lingered unanswered, and the island's deep silence seemed to echo with the unanswered questions. What had happened to James Mackle? Had he truly wandered too far? Or was there something more sinister hidden within the forest's dark depths? Nearly 8 years had passed since James Mackle vanished into the dense wilderness of Vancouver Island, and for all intents and purposes, the mystery of his disappearance had faded into the shadows of forgotten cases. But in April 2021, something unimaginable surfaced from the depths of the forest, a discovery that would send shockwaves through the local community and reawaken the chilling questions that had never quite been answered. Two locals, out gathering medicinal plants far from the well-trodden paths, stumbled upon an area of the forest that seemed strangely out of place. As they ventured deeper into the undergrowth, the atmosphere grew unnaturally still. The dense trees formed an almost perfect canopy, muting the sounds of the world beyond. Then, hidden among the thick moss and ferns, they saw something that made their blood run cold. A totem pole, old and weathered, standing alone in a small hollow. But it wasn't the totem itself that caught their attention. It was the white, almost ghostly object positioned in the center of it. As they drew closer, their eyes locked onto the grisly sight. A human skull, crudely nailed to the totem pole. The nail, rusted and long, had pierced straight through one of the skull's eye sockets, pinning it firmly to the wood. The sight was haunting, like something out of a horror story, and it became immediately clear that this was not a natural occurrence. Someone had gone to great lengths to create this macabre installation, a gruesome act that went far beyond what could be explained by nature or accident. This wasn't just a body left to rot in the woods, it was a deliberate, horrific display. The air in the forest seemed to thicken as if the trees themselves held their breath. The discovery was reported to the authorities, and soon forensic teams arrived to investigate the strange and chilling find. Every inch of the area was meticulously examined, and a slow, careful process began. As the skull was carefully removed from the totem, its grim placement raised more questions than answers. Forensic anthropologists, upon closer inspection, confirmed that the skull bore characteristics consistent with a person who had been missing for many years, James Mackle. The forensic team worked diligently to confirm the identity of the skull, and the evidence pointed unmistakably to James. Dental records provided the first match. The unique dental work James had received years before, when compared to the skull's X-rays, showed a near-perfect match. But the eerie implications didn't stop there. Scattered around the totem pole were other items that linked directly back to James. The first was a watch, a Casio G-Shock, which had been described by his family as the one he had worn during his hike. It was cracked, its hands frozen in time, but the strap was intact, a chilling reminder of the man who had once worn it. Beneath the watch, almost hidden beneath a layer of damp earth, lay another item, a smashed, weathered iPhone 4. The phone was unrecognizable, its screen shattered, but the presence of the device added another layer of eerie confirmation. The phone, like the watch, belonged to James Mackle. It was as if the forest itself had kept these items hidden, preserved in time, until the day they would be found. The discovery of the skull, along with the items, was a revelation that reclassified the case entirely. What had once been a missing persons case was now a murder investigation. The cold, silent years since James's disappearance suddenly took on a darker meaning. This was no accident, no unfortunate run-in with the wilderness. James Mackle had been killed, and the forest had been his silent witness. The question now was not how he had died, but why. The forest had kept its secrets for nearly a decade, and now it was time for the truth to be unearthed, no matter how sinister it might be. As the discovery of James Mackle's skull sent shockwaves through the community, investigators were thrust back into a mystery they thought had been long buried. What had happened to James? The forensic evidence now clearly suggested foul play, but the motive and the identity of the killer were still a dark, unshakable unknown. Two theories emerged, each more chilling than the last. The first theory was the most straightforward, though no less disturbing. It revolved around the possibility that James had stumbled upon a camp of aggressive bushmen or poachers, individuals who lived off the grid in the remote forests of Vancouver Island, often avoiding the law and shunning society. These hermits and poachers, living in isolation, could easily become paranoid, viewing any outsiders as threats. James, an unassuming tourist, might have unknowingly wandered too close to one of these hidden camps, perhaps even discovering something illicit. The killer, fearing that James might have seen something he shouldn't, could have murdered him to silence a witness. In this theory, James's death wasn't just an act of violence, but an attempt to protect a secret, whether it was a poaching operation, an illegal camp, or something even darker. The idea that James had inadvertently crossed paths with such a person, someone who lived on the fringes of society, made the case feel even more sinister. The second theory was far more unsettling, suggesting that James's death was not the result of a random encounter, but a deliberate act tied to something much more esoteric and ritualistic. Investigators began to entertain the possibility that the killer was part of a cult or an isolated radical group that practiced strange rituals far from the prying eyes of society. The symbolism of the skull being nailed to a totem pole, an ancient and sacred object to indigenous peoples, pointed to the possibility of a ritualistic murder. The killer, or killers, might have viewed this place as a place of power, a sacred space where such an act could be performed. The careful, deliberate manner in which the skull was attached to the totem spoke of someone who had a deep, twisted understanding of ritual, using James's death not just as a crime, but as an offering, a twisted tribute to something darker, something hidden within the forests of Vancouver Island. As the investigation unfolded, one witness came forward whose testimony would prove pivotal in shaping the course of the case. Gary Fullerton, a retired lumberjack, had been working in the area around the time of James's disappearance, and his recollection would become an unsettling thread in the tapestry of the investigation. Gary remembered seeing a strange man deep in the forest, a man who didn't fit the usual image of a tourist or hiker. The man was dressed in tattered, weather-worn clothing made of deerskin or rough canvas, and over his shoulder he carried an old rifle. His face was obscured by a thick, tangled beard and long hair, but what Gary remembered most was the man's eyes, cold, empty, and distant. Gary had slowed his truck to offer help, but the stranger had merely turned and stared, silently, before continuing his way into the thick forest. Gary had brushed it off at the time, just another odd encounter in the wilds of Vancouver Island. But now, years later, the encounter seemed too strange to ignore. Could this man, this shadowy figure with the unsettling stare, be the killer? His description, though vague, led investigators to reconsider the possibility of a lone hermit being involved in James's death. The theory gained traction as they realized that someone living off the grid, far removed from civilization, might be able to carry out such a crime undetected. The man Gary had seen seemed to embody the isolation and paranoia that might be found in such an individual, a loner with a troubled past who had turned to violence in an attempt to protect his solitude. As the investigation continued, the mystery deepened. Was this the face of the killer, an isolated hermit living in the depths of the island's wilderness? Or was James's death something more sinister, a ritual tied to an unknown cult? The theories swirled, but the truth seemed as elusive as the thick fog that often cloaked the island's forests. As the investigation into James Mackle's murder progressed, the police began to piece together a chilling picture of the killer's life, one that was hidden in the dark, isolated corners of Vancouver Island. After months of following leads and retracing steps, a breakthrough came when a special operations team was deployed to search a remote ravine, a place where they believed the killer might have made his home. The area was deep in the wilderness, far from the popular trails, and difficult to access, which explained why it had remained undisturbed for so long. What the team found there would send a shiver down their spines. Tucked away in the dense undergrowth was an abandoned camp. It was a place that spoke of isolation, a shelter constructed from the raw materials of the forest itself. The camp, a crude structure, had been built into the hillside, with a roof made of bark and moss. It was a hovel, primitive and bare, but it was clear that someone had lived there for an extended period of time. The atmosphere was thick with a sense of foreboding, as if the very air held secrets of the past. This was not a tourist's campsite or the home of a casual hiker. This was something different, something darker. The investigators carefully combed through the site, their eyes scanning the ground for anything that could reveal the identity of the person who had lived there. Among the scattered debris, they found disturbing items. Animal bones, some gnawed and others broken, were scattered about. The remains of deer and bear carcasses littered the area, evidence of hunting and butchery. But it wasn't just the bones that unsettled the investigators, it was the strange engravings they discovered carved into the bones. Symbols, marks that appeared to be drawn by hand, were etched into the bones in a pattern that made little sense at first glance. Were they just the work of a person trying to pass the time in solitude, or did they have deeper, more sinister meaning? The images were bizarre and almost cryptic, like something out of an ancient ritual, but it was what they found next that would become the most important clue. A collection of old handmade nails, similar to the one that had been used to nail James's skull to the totem pole. These nails were rusted and weathered, the kind that might have been forged by hand decades ago. They were not something you would find in a hardware store today. It was this chilling discovery that led the investigators to a more disturbing conclusion. The killer had been living here in the forest for a long time. The camp was his home, a place where he had hidden from society and the law. The nails, the bones, the strange symbols, they all pointed to a life spent in isolation, away from the world, driven by motives that only the killer could understand. As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, the police started to build a profile of the killer. They theorized that he was likely a hermit, someone who had chosen to live far from civilization, disconnected from the society that had once rejected him or that he had rejected in return. This hermit, living in his own twisted world, likely suffered from deep psychological disorders, possibly a form of paranoia or delusion that led him to commit murder. The strange symbols, the bizarre rituals, and the careful way the skull had been displayed, all of these suggested a disturbed mind, one that found meaning in violence and isolation. But despite this new information, the investigation remained frustratingly incomplete. The police had a profile of the killer, a sense of his motives, and the eerie discoveries at his camp, but they still lacked the crucial piece, his identity. No one had seen him. No one knew where he came from or where he had gone. The leads they had followed, witness testimonies, background checks, even information about other disappearances in the area, only seemed to lead to dead ends. The killer's ghost remained hidden in the shadows of the forest, a figure who had managed to avoid detection for years. The investigation had reached a point of high tension. Every lead seemed to spiral into uncertainty, and with each passing month, the chances of finding the killer seemed to dwindle. The police were no closer to making an arrest, and the case remained an enigma. But the discovery of the hermit's camp, with its sinister signs and unsettling implications, had brought them closer than ever to the truth. Yet that truth seemed as elusive as ever. Would they ever uncover the identity of the man who had brought such horror to the peaceful wilderness of Vancouver Island? Only time would tell. As the investigation into James Mackle's murder continued, the search for answers grew increasingly fruitless. Despite months of intense scrutiny, forensic analysis, and the chilling discoveries in the forest, the killer's identity remained a mystery. The profile of the man who had lived in the wilderness, the hermit-like figure who had possibly committed murder as part of a twisted ritual, was becoming more detailed. Yet, the lack of concrete evidence, combined with the killer's disappearance into the vast expanse of Vancouver Island, meant that every lead seemed to lead nowhere. The investigators had hit a wall. With no clear suspects, no new physical evidence to examine, and no witnesses coming forward, the case began to go cold once more. Officially, it was still open, but the active investigation slowed to a crawl. Investigators continued to revisit the evidence, re-examine old testimonies, and cross-check files, but progress seemed minimal. The frustration of the police force and the community only deepened as time passed. The case, which had once felt like it was on the verge of being solved, was slipping further away, buried under the layers of time and the remote isolation of Vancouver Island. Meanwhile, the media, which had once covered the case extensively, also seemed to lose interest. The initial shock of the discovery of a skull nailed to a totem pole in the woods had gripped the public's attention. But as the months turned into years and no further breakthroughs were made, the story began to fade from the headlines. The silence grew. Journalists, once eager to report on every new development, started to pull back, their cameras and microphones no longer trained on the case. The gruesome murder was now relegated to the background of newsrooms, overshadowed by the day-to-day grind of other stories. In truth, the case had become just another unsolved mystery, lingering like a fog in the past, with no resolution in sight. However, there was more at play than just the waning public interest. Behind the scenes, the authorities found themselves under increasing pressure. Vancouver Island, with its stunning natural beauty, had long been a tourist destination, drawing visitors from around the world to its rugged coastline and serene forests. The story of James Mackle's gruesome death, though deeply unsettling, had the potential to tarnish the island's image. Officials were quietly concerned about the impact on tourism, especially as the case continued to remain unsolved. The fear was that the longer the case remained in the spotlight, the more it could deter visitors from flocking to the island, deterred by the thought of a killer lurking in the very forests they sought to explore. The growing pressure to downplay the investigation became evident. Authorities began to quietly shift their focus, not to the truth, but to ensuring that the public perception of Vancouver Island remained intact. The tourism industry, an important economic pillar of the region, was at stake. The once high-profile murder investigation was now being handled with an increasing degree of silence. Public statements were vague, offering little in the way of new developments. The words, "The investigation is ongoing," became a repeated refrain, a hollow promise that seemed to ring more and more empty with each passing day. As the bureaucratic silence grew, so did the frustration of the victims' families, particularly James's sister, Sarah. The authorities were no longer chasing the killer with the same vigor as before, and as the investigation stalled, it became increasingly clear that the case was slowly being buried under layers of governmental apathy. The questions, however, remained. Who had killed James Mackle? Was the killer still out there, hiding in the forest? Or had he moved on, perhaps leaving the island forever? Would the truth ever be uncovered? The case of James Mackle, once full of promise and mystery, had become a lingering question, one that might never be answered. The eerie silence of the forest, the unanswered questions, and the haunting remains of the totem pole seemed to mock the authorities who had failed to find closure. The island's beauty continued to attract tourists, but the shadow of James's unsolved murder hung over it, a reminder of a mystery that might never be solved. As the years roll on, the case of James Mackle remains one of Vancouver Island's most haunting mysteries. The answers who the killer was, why James had to die, and whether he still roams the very woods where his crime unfolded remain elusive. The silence of the forest, once again, seems impenetrable, and the chilling image of a skull nailed to a totem pole is now part of the island's dark history. But the questions linger, unanswered and unresolved. What truly happened to James? Was he the victim of a twisted hermit, a lost soul with a troubled past, or something far darker, linked to a sinister cult? Or could the killer still be out there, blending into the wilderness, watching unsuspecting tourists walk the very paths James once did. It's a possibility that sends a shiver down the spine, knowing that the killer, in all likelihood, remains anonymous, his crime an unsettling shadow over a beautiful, untamed land. Perhaps he's out there still, in the thick of the woods, remembering his twisted actions, blending in with the quiet of nature. The case may be officially closed, but the truth is far from resolved. The eerie uncertainty of James's fate continues to haunt, and as long as the killer remains unknown, the mystery lives on. If you're intrigued by unsolved mysteries like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for notifications. We'll be back with more chilling stories, digging into the darkest corners of true crime. Join us, and let's uncover the truth together.